Okay, we will go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everybody this afternoon to the final day of this Nebraska Community Aid and Juvenile Justice Conference. And happy that we and the rest of this panel can be part of the presentations that you all get to see. This afternoon, what we're going to be presenting on as a group is entitled Addressing the Classroom to Courtroom Pathway Through Restorative Justice Principles, and specifically two different programs that have been developed in our jurisdiction. The first one called SAMI, and the second one that we call Restore. Here this afternoon, what we're going to be doing is talking through with members of 4 different disciplines that all have a role in addressing the classroom to courtroom pathway. So you're going to hear from law enforcement, you're going to hear from the education, you're going to hear from the prosecutors, you're also going to hear from folks in the research field that then take a look at the work that we're doing and see really what's happening through the use of these programs that have been developed. So we're going to start off here just sharing a bit about ourselves, kind of introducing ourselves. We're going to talk to you about the background of our jurisdiction and kind of the unique aspects of our jurisdiction and the school system that we have here in Lancaster County and in Lincoln, Nebraska. Then we're going to talk through with you about what the problems were that were being identified in our community, and then the solution that was developed to try to address that problem. And then finally, Dr. Weiner will be sharing with us what he's found through researching and really looking at some of the data that's been pulled out of these 2 programs. What we're going to do first, just a little introduction. I'll ask first Jason Stilley, the captain with the Lincoln Police Department, to tell us a little bit about himself and his background in law enforcement, and then also what his role has been kind of historically in dealing with matters involving juvenile justice. Jason.
Thank you. Afternoon, everybody. My name is Jason Stilley. I'm a captain with the Lincoln Police Department. I'm currently in charge of the Management Services Division. It's also called Professional Standards in other jurisdictions. We mainly deal with accreditation, policy review, use of force and pursuit review, legislative liaison. We wear a variety of hats. Because of the nature of our agency, it's fairly small for the size of city. So I'm also the Special Weapons and Tactics Commander, and became involved in juvenile justice after I got promoted to the rank of captain. There was an opening for a liaison on our local racial and ethnic disparities team. So I took that over in about 2011, 2012, and became interested going forward. So it put me in a unique position as we started to form up Restore and SAMI at that time.
Thanks, Jason. I'll introduce myself. My name is Chris Turner. My position is as Chief Deputy of the Juvenile Division for the Lancaster County Attorney's Office. In my office, we have about 37 prosecutors and attorneys, and we are subdivided then among civil attorneys, criminal prosecutors, and then myself and 5 other attorneys that handle all the matters in juvenile court. So we do everything from child abuse neglect, we do habitual truancy and educational neglect, and then one of our primary responsibilities then is responding to any law enforcement referrals for youth under 18 years of age that happen in our jurisdiction. I've been an attorney now for about 12 years. All of that has been in prosecution. I was a juvenile prosecutor for the first 2 years. Then I went into the criminal prosecution world, did everything from traffic prosecution like speeding tickets and DUIs, to then narcotics prosecutions, and then ultimately did sexual assault and child crimes involving internet exploitation before entering my role about 2 years ago as the Chief Deputy of Juvenile. I'll now ask Joe Wright to introduce himself.
Thank you, Chris. Joe Wright, Director of Security for Lincoln Public Schools. I direct a unit that handles traditional security and emergency response planning for the school district. We also run a comprehensive threat management program and investigate student-involved Title IX investigations. Another part of our job is to collaborate with the criminal justice system here in Lincoln and Lancaster County, and specifically to work with the Lincoln Police Department with the SRO program, as the SROs are embedded into our middle and high schools, to make sure that programming and parallel education for our administrators and SROs goes smoothly and brings about the results we want. Prior to me being here, I've been here for about 7 years. I was at the Lincoln Police Department, and before the Racial and Ethnic Disparities Committee existed, back in the old days, it was called the Disproportionate Minority Contact Committee, or DMC Committee, and I was a member of that. I think right about when it started quite a while ago, and when I left LPD and came to LPS, I wanted to stay on that committee because of the good work that it does. So it's a real pleasure to be here and be able to talk about this subject.
Thanks, Joe. And Dr. Weiner, if you could introduce yourself.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rich Weiner. I'm a faculty member at UNL in the Law and Psychology program, professor of law and psychology. I teach both in the graduate school in psychology as well as in the law school. And I direct and guide research in a variety of areas, looking at both laboratory research as well as field studies at the intersection of psychology and legal issues. I've done a good deal of program evaluation in the last several years, working a bit for the Nebraska Judiciary, for probation, and for Lancaster County. And I and 3 of my graduate students in the last couple of years put together a database that summarizes a good deal of the experiences of the juvenile justice system in Lancaster County. And I want to be able to share a little bit later on this afternoon with you some of the preliminary findings that we have, talk about that database, and tell you what we know about the classroom to courtroom pathway more generally, and then a little more specifically about Restore and Standards. So I'll be talking about that later on this afternoon.
Thank you, Dr. Weiner. And as we get started here, folks, definitely this panel wants to answer questions. So as you have those, type them into the chat box. I'll do my best to monitor those comments and those questions, and then throw those out to the different panelists so that we can have some interaction here virtually. First off, as we get started then, I'll ask Joe. He's going to tell us a little bit about Lincoln, Nebraska, and some of the particulars with not only the city, but also then with the school district that he works with for Lincoln Public Schools.
For those who aren't familiar, Lincoln's the capital city of the state of Nebraska, second largest city, just under 300,000. So we're still actually pretty small. Our poverty rate is not especially high, although that's, these days that's probably hidden a little bit. We have a lot more families doubling up than we know sometimes. But what's consistent with probably most communities, at least in the Midwest, alcohol and drugs are present in a lot of the police work and police responses that occur everywhere, including at the schools. About 20% of all calls for service that the police are involved in have some type of drug or alcohol involvement. And then as far as the school district goes, I heard this once, I'm not sure if it's true, but I think Lincoln is the largest city in the United States that's not connected to another city. So the entire community of Lincoln has no boundary pushing up against it where there might be another school district. So we are served by one singular public school district for the whole city. That's about 42,000 students. 46% free and reduced lunch statistic is real informative, because that's a metric that's kept and calculated consistently across the country. So that's a nice number to compare with other cities or other communities to know where they're at poverty-wise. We are a secondary and permanent relocation site for newcomers, meaning we have a lot of people coming in from different places, including our Karen population, a lot of newcomers from Iraq, and the Kurdish community, especially from northern Iraq. And we speak over 60 languages. In one of our high schools, Lincoln High School, we have over 28 different languages spoken there. With that said, we're still a majority white population.
All right, now I'd like to give you kind of an overview of what the juvenile justice system looks like for our jurisdiction. So you can kind of picture then how these different pieces end up fitting together and the collaboration that happens among all of these different kind of disciplines and how we all work together. So first, obviously, we have a law enforcement referral that's going to take place. as it pertains to school-based offenses that we're going to be focused on today. As Joe indicated, we do have school resource officers in our high school. So there is one school resource officer assigned to each high school. In the middle schools, there is one school resource officer assigned to two high schools, or two middle schools, excuse me. And so if there is some sort of law enforcement response that is needed, it would be that school resource officer that would be alerted and then asked to respond. So they obviously have discretion, as law enforcement always does. So if they're called to investigate some sort of incident, whether that be an assault or a property crime, they obviously have the discretion to not take any formal action and handle that informally. If they do decide to take a formal action, that would be in the form of a referral. So that would be a paper referral similar to a citation, but a paper referral that would then get sent to the county attorney's office and me and my staff to then have it processed. At that point in the county attorney phase, when we're reviewing that, we're doing a couple of things. And primarily, we're looking to see, do we believe that there is sufficient evidence to believe that this offense was committed, and could we prove it beyond a reasonable doubt if there was eventually a trial? And we know then ethically, if we review a case that's been referred to us, and certainly the officer had probable cause to believe that an offense was committed, that was their legal standard. But now we have a higher standard of beyond a reasonable doubt. And if we review that case and determine that we don't believe that we could prove that someone was responsible beyond a reasonable doubt, then ethically we have to take no action. And so there would be no formal intervention in that case. And that's true regardless of whether or not we believe that there should be an intervention. There's certainly some cases that we look at as prosecutors that I'm firmly of the belief that this family needs an intervention or that youth needs an intervention. They would really benefit from some of the resources that we've developed in our community. But if we can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt, and we don't feel comfortable that we could prove that, then there can be no intervention. If we're reviewing that and we think, yep, there is sufficient evidence to proceed forward, then we're going to consider these three options down here below. And one of the options can be, even if we could prove it, that we may decide to take no formal intervention at all. We may do nothing other than issue a warning letter and tell the parent, we'd like you to just inform the child that we're not going to proceed forward formally, and allow you to do whatever sort of consequences you think are appropriate, and that will be the end of the response for that referral. We could have the youth participate in one of our diversionary programs, and we'll talk here in a moment about a number of the diversion programs that have been developed in our community. And then the final option would be a formal filing in our juvenile courts, filing essentially charging documents, notifying the parents, having the parent and the youth come into court with an attorney appointed to then begin that process, where the ultimate outcome would be a term of probation with our state probation office. So again, that gives you kind of an overview sense of how the typical referral would be handled in our jurisdiction. These are some of the options that have been developed over time, and you can see we have a number of them, and I'll talk to you just kind of first about links. So links is an ability that we have as we meet the partnership between the county attorney's office and the schools. And if the school are having kind of seeing some issues with a student that they believe, they haven't entered the juvenile justice system yet, they haven't committed a criminal offense yet, they haven't even gotten to the point of being referred maybe for habitual truancy, but they're starting down a pathway that gives us some concern that that's where they may ultimately ending up. They have the ability to contact my office and request that the youth be given access to a links assessment. And that links assessment would be basically a mental health evaluation that would be done by a professional that would try to get to the core reasons why that youth is having that behavior, whether that behavior is leaving home without permission, not attending school, maybe they're having aggressive or assaultive behaviors in the home. The idea would be, before we get down to the step of having to be on probation, let's try to back up the system and give some intervention and some options to that family. Another program that's been developed is a truancy diversion program. That's where we have social workers, in-home therapy options for students that have reached that threshold under Nebraska law to be found habitually truant. Again, it's something before the court system that we could do and utilize to try to keep kids out of court, but back in school and getting the services that they need to address that problem. But the one we'll be highlighting today is our Restore and our SAMI programs. And so you're going to hear more about these particular programs, and they're an intervention that we have before we even get down into our community-based diversion, which I think, as I talk to other jurisdictions, what would be commonly referred to as their diversion programs, Restore and SAMI, or even a level before that. So youth who do Restore and SAMI are still eligible later on if they have more law enforcement intervention, or more law enforcement referrals, or more law enforcement contact. They would still be eligible for our basic or our standard community-based diversion programs. One thing that for me, at least as a prosecutor, when I started coming back into the world of juvenile justice and juvenile delinquency matters, was I came from a criminal prosecution perspective, right, where I was responsible for prosecuting, people committing sexual assault offenses and internet crimes against children and child enticement crimes and child pornography crimes. So really serious stuff. And so my mind frame was very much set on punishment. And that is kind of a typical lens. I think most prosecutors, we see that as our role, especially in the adult side. And it's been a transition, and a good transition for me to really understand some of the science behind, a punishment and a consequence is not always the best outcome. We don't always have to go 100%, pounding people with consequences to try to change behavior. And there certainly has been research on this, and it's good for people like me to see that and have it communicated from the professionals, and then really studied by folks like Dr. Weiner, so they can tell us what are the results sometimes if we use a lesser intervention. And that's really what we try to think about, is identifying what the risk level is for a youth, what the needs are for that youth, and then matching that to the intervention, so that we're not overdosing youth with the highest level intervention, looking at probation and out-of-home placements, if really a lesser dosage of intervention would really serve that youth the best and lessen the chance that they're going to come back into our system later on. And this really ties into that point. Ultimately, why do we look at diversion as a system? Why do we consider utilizing that as why is the school system invested in us utilizing diversion for offenses that are happening within the school? Why is law enforcement on board with the county attorney's office utilizing diversion? Well, these are just some of the reasons. And we think we can lower recidivism. We think we can certainly reduce system costs, and we can provide a lot of service and education through these diversionary programs up at the front, and hopefully avoid that youth from committing more serious offenses and repeated offenses in the future, and really ending up deeper and deeper in our juvenile justice system. And that's what we're going to be talking about with all of you today. And I'll turn it over here to Joe to talk to a little bit about why the education system, and why specifically Lincoln Public Schools is a partner in these efforts.
We obviously care about the criminal justice outcomes and reality in and of themselves for youth in our community. However, as part of our mission, we have some important measurements which let us know if we're serving our kids with what we're trying to do specifically in education. And one of those measurements is graduation. And I'm sure Dr. Weiner could expand on this, and has a lot more data of all the different effects that involvement in the criminal justice system can have, which are detrimental to someone's educational outcome, but to very clear-cut things, which I think help you understand why we're so invested in this type of program, is that students who are processed in court, going through the procedures of what Chris just talked about, are 4 times as likely not to graduate as those who are not processed through court. And then just on the basis of an arrest, a student who is arrested is twice as likely not to graduate as a student who has never been arrested. So that's why we're very much want to be a partner in this, to try and get outcomes, not only general outcomes for the kids, but specific educational outcomes as well.
Okay, Lincoln enjoys a fairly low crime rate compared to other similar mid-sized cities. And this is a function of a variety of things: a great school system, the presence of a lot of great nonprofits, fantastic leadership, I think, at all levels of government, and kind of a collaborative policing model. Typical juvenile offenses that you're going to see citywide can be pretty much summed up in about 3 different silos: property crimes, drug violations, and violent crime. Property crimes are driven by vandalism and theft, anything from breaking windows and mailboxes, graffiti, sometimes influenced by gang activity and sometimes not. And then also theft, shoplifting is a big one, the stealing of anything from iPhones to bikes, but we're also seeing a spike in youth stealing cars as well now. Drug violations, the vast majority are going to be marijuana and paraphernalia related. But we do also see the possession and distribution of prescription pills, methamphetamine, and cocaine possession as well. And then violent crime is overwhelmingly made up of minor assaults, but it also includes sexual assault, robbery, serious bodily injury, result assaults, and even homicide on occasion. So when we get into talking about Restore, we started looking at what is driving crime and referrals from the police in schools. We did look at two different data sets, 16 and over and 15 and under, mainly because we were seeing a lot of different traffic-related offenses for youth, and that's just how we had to compile the data. But at the end of the day, looking at why officers were referring youth in schools or school-related activities, there were three main things that leapt out at us. The first is going to be assaults. The next is disturbing the peace or violations against social order, and then drug possession as well.
What probably won't surprise people if you weren't aware is that there's disproportionality in school discipline, just as there is disproportionality in a lot of measures of criminal justice activities such as traffic stops or things like that. So as you can see, 35% of our population in Lincoln of our students are students of color, and they receive 51% of the suspension time. So a suspension is a mandatory time out of school as a result of a school discipline. So that disproportionality is present, and the reason we're looking for issues in the system that shows statistical significance of being disproportional, so we can look to those offenses and the outcomes of those offenses to see if we can make an impact. So from that comes our Racial and Ethnic Disparities Committee, which has been up and running in Lancaster County for quite some time. As I said, originally called the Disproportionate Minority Contact Committee. Racial and ethnic disparities is it's a lot better term, a lot newer term, and more accurate. We have many community partners involved in that committee, and foundational partners, which have always been there, include the people on this presentation today, schools, law enforcement, and our prosecutor's office.
As we move on here to kind of describing what came out of all of that work and the work of the Racial and Ethnic Disparities Committee, back in 2015, 2016, when these programs were being developed, I know there was a partnership with Georgetown University, and they helped kind of look at some data for our jurisdiction. And as Jason pointed out, and as Joe pointed out, you looked at all those things together, and it became clear that the opportunity to really make a potential difference in some of those disparities was to look at alcohol and marijuana-based offenses, and then those assaults and disturbing the peace, which I'm sure Joe could tell you, disturbing the peace can have a wide range of behavior that may support that, but oftentimes we're talking about everything just short of, fists being thrown and strikes being landed are the most likely things to actually be referred in as a law enforcement response, where we have major disruptions of the school, major disruptions during a lunch because someone's getting very aggressive and hot and heated and not following directions. And so that was really where the first program that we're going to talk about, Project Restore, was developed. What this program is it is specific to referrals for assault and disturbing the peace, as those were noted to be two of the highest drivers of referrals. And all youth within Lancaster County that would be eligible for a juvenile court filing, so 11 to 17 years of age, are eligible for this program. And what it is it is a program based upon restorative justice principles. And we're going to talk about that here in a few moments, kind of specifically what a what an intervention like Restore looks like for us. Things that we developed kind of as a team approach, though, would be, okay, what youth or what situations would not be appropriate for this level of intervention? Again, matching the intervention to the youth and to the circumstances is appropriate. So as a prosecutor, I'm not okay with domestic violence or sexual assault offenses, anything doing with a sexual assault-based offense, having this level of intervention. So those are specifically excluded. Youth that have already participated in diversion for assault, they've already had a higher level of intervention. If they've done that for an assault-based offense, and now we have another assault in the school, they will not be eligible to participate in Restore. Same thing for a youth that is already on probation, already has a probation officer, they've been in front of a judge, there's already a case plan developed through the court system, and that youth will not be eligible to participate in Restore. But what that still leaves us in is a large amount of youth that are essentially first time getting in trouble with the juvenile justice system, getting some sort of law enforcement referral. Those are the youth that are going to be served through this Restore program. And they're going to go through and have a case plan that gets developed and a Project Restore case manager that's assigned. And so that case manager is someone that really wears two hats. They are a diversion officer that works with youth on our community-based diversion. And then she also wears the hat of the Project Restore case manager. And she's going to go out in the non-COVID times, if we weren't in a pandemic, she's going to physically go visit that youth at school. So she's going to have some interaction there with the school staff. She's going to visit the youth at school to make sure they're completing all of their program requirements. Each of the students that are referred to this program, the expectation is going to be that they're going to participate in this restorative justice practice that is led by one of our trained mediators. So in our jurisdiction, we're very lucky. We have a group called the Mediation Center here in downtown Lincoln that is a large group of trained mediators that will facilitate an offender and victim discussion that really goes through and tries to get to the heart of making sure the person responsible for that behavior is understanding of all of the harm that was caused. And so they need to understand, okay, not only was there some physical pain involved because you punched someone and you've caused them physical pain and they had a cut and they had to have a Band-Aid maybe, or they had to go get an ice pack, but really ensuring that they understand all of the other harm that was caused as a result of that, kind of the ripple effects. And that can either come through the victim actually sharing that information themselves, or if the victim is not wanting to participate in that mediation, then they would have a victim surrogate. So we have some trained surrogates that are also high school age students that are willing to participate and kind of sit in the role of the victim and share with them, okay, let's, not only did you cause the student physical harm, but there's fear that goes along with that. And maybe they have some unanswered questions. And as part of this conference, the victim will be able to ask, why did you do that to me? Why did you target me? Is there something that I did? Is there any bad blood that's still happening between us, to hopefully address some of the other concerns the victim may have. There's also a chance for the victim's family to talk about the harm that was caused. Maybe it's financial because the student had to go to the emergency room or had to have a doctor's visit. Maybe the parent had to take off work to come pick up their student. And so they can share all of that so that there's kind of a full understanding as part of that restorative practice to the harm that was caused. Out of that conference and through that mediation, there will be a plan that gets developed, and there's some plan components that are always going to happen. And then there are some that are kind of specific to what's generated by the victim and by the youth. And that can be things like apology letters. It can be restitution. So the youth being responsible for paying, the copay or paying the office visit, doing community service hours. That's one that's often utilized. And the goal then is for those parties to agree on that, because we think, I as a prosecutor and law enforcement, we're in the victim business. And I think that's something that Jason and Joe would be able to tell you. We have to be concerned about, how is the victim going to see this response? What's my community going to think about this response? And sometimes I'll have victims' parents call me and say, this is a slap on the wrist. This is a joke. You're not going to do anything. What do you mean that kid punched my kid and he gets away with it? And so I need to be able to tell them all of the things that we're going to do to ensure that we're doing the best thing we can to ensure that this doesn't happen again. And talking through with them what it means to be part of a victim youth conference. about restitution being a possibility, what all the steps are that that youth is going to have to do, and that it's not just a slap on the wrist, and that it's really a targeted approach. I need to be able to tell that and communicate that to my victim and their family so that they feel like they've been heard, understanding that they did suffer as a result of this, and that this isn't going to just be a slap on the wrist or just get swept under the rug. That this is a real response. One thing that was decided upon very early as these programs are being developed is that this had to move fast. And you know, there's the obvious thing of, okay, we're dealing with youth here, and the consequence or the intervention should be tied as closely as possible to the behavior that we're trying to intervene and stop from happening again, right? But we're all busy. You know, there's a process that takes place for law enforcement to investigate an offense, to issue referrals, for you know, records departments to process those referrals and enter them into their databases and enter them into their record keeping systems, for my staff to open our files, to prep those documents, to have an attorney review them, to make decisions about is there sufficient evidence or not. There's a lot of steps in the process before an intervention can take place. But all the parties at the time that this program was developed put really wanted to put emphasis on this having to move fast. And so we tried to do that. I think Dr. Weiner will be able to share a little bit of our data about how quickly we're able to process these referrals to get interventions in place. But what was developed and agreed upon is that at the time a school resource officer issues a referral, basically the same day, the records department is getting that referral. Within the same day, or maybe the next day, I'm going to get that referral as the county attorney's office. So instead of the typical practice, which would be records department processing referrals once a day, they might bring reports up to our office on a daily basis. Right now, I could get a knock on my door with one of these referrals, and I know that I need to look at it immediately. I can't put it in my tray and wait to look at it on Monday or Tuesday. It's got to be done right away. And as soon as that referral gets reviewed by me and a decision gets made, is the student eligible? Is there sufficient evidence to believe that they've committed an offense? Then it's going to move on to that restore or that SAMI person, if it's going to be eligible, to then begin the process of communicating with the family, beginning the case plan, and getting up to speed and getting that mediator informed that there's a new referral coming in and that their contact needs to be happening as soon as possible with the family of the youth and the family of the victim. And this is something else, just as partners, you know, if you're going to think about doing something like this, I would just say you got to hold each other accountable. And so the restore staff that runs out of our diversion office is always very good about holding me accountable. So if I'm not getting things to them quickly enough, they're going to let me know. And that's something that's really important. But everybody has really been on the same page, I think, with this, and they see the importance of it and the need to fast track this faster than we handle all the other referrals that come through the system. Some of the initial outcomes we looked at through the first few years, you know, we looked at, okay, of those youth that are being referred to complete this Project Restore program, what sort of things are they being required to do, with what frequency? So you can kind of see some of those information there. So overwhelmingly, we're having participation in the mediation process. Overwhelmingly, they're completing apology letters. Community service is less frequent, but again, that's something that's being agreed upon by the victim and the offender at the time of their mediation. And then 70% or so are writing reflection papers.
So as Restore seemed to make a lot of sense to us, and also because it was attacking a data point that we wanted to hit, we saw how a kind of a companion or a parallel program could work that would go to school-based alcohol and marijuana incidents where students are found to be in possession of alcohol or marijuana at school, where an SRO or another officer would intervene and issue a referral. This is a little bit different than assault or disturbing the peace because we have the nature of the victim is a little bit different here. The state, so to speak, is the victim. However, that makes it a little bit easier probably on Chris's behalf because he doesn't have to manage that victim as much as he can speak as the victim. But otherwise, it's pretty similar. We're looking to contact youth 11 to 17 with an immediate intervention. And instead of some punitive end to a citation or referral, we're looking to engage youth into some type of a alcohol or drug assessment, which is going to educate the student and the family to any vulnerabilities they may have, the importance of what can happen when you become involved in drugs and alcohol, and hopefully create some type of resistance to reoffending, and engagement in an online curriculum is part of that process. And as Chris talked, this has to be speedy. Part of what we're trying to do here, if we can, is to waive the suspension that comes along with the offense at school. So if you understand how a school suspension works, that initiates right at the time that the offense is discovered or determined to have happened. So the suspension starts right then and there, and could be 1 to 5 days of out of school, or a combination of out of school and in school suspension. So if we want to try and lop some time off the end of that suspension so the student doesn't have to serve all that time away from school, which we really don't want, that means that this process has to be lightning fast so we can engage right away to get kids back into school and beat that end of suspension time.
So as this jurisdiction developed these two programs, eventually you get to the phase of, all right, how are we doing? Are we meeting the goals of what we were hoping to do? Are we doing this? Are we implementing this quickly? Are we getting these turned around fast? Are we seeing are we seeing our youth that participate in this? Are they coming right back in a week later, a month later, 2 months later? Those are all things that we need to evaluate. And so I think each of us, given our different disciplines, we have our own data points. And so I know certainly the public school system, they're going to keep data on the frequency of suspensions or behavioral interventions. Law enforcement, they have data about the number of contacts for a particular person and how often they're getting referred and to what sort of offenses are getting referred. My office keeps data about how often are we charging, how often are we taking someone to court versus using a diversion. But if you think about it, this is something that I, as a prosecutor, would look at because I'm not a researcher, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a math person. That's why I couldn't do what Dr. Weiner does. Luckily, he's very good at explaining his process, so I can dumb my way through that. But this is what I would look at as a prosecutor to see, just generally, are we having the impact that I'm hoping we're having, which is, as a prosecutor, the more I utilize diversion as an intervention, or the more I utilize just allowing the parent to impose consequences as an intervention instead of the court system, I should see my law violation filing numbers go down. And that's something we keep track of, and we've seen that go down. That's consistent with what we think we're doing as far as utilizing the just parents themselves imposing consequences without a formal intervention, utilizing things like our Restore program, our SAMI program, utilizing our general diversion programs. And for us as prosecutors, one of the things that we like by doing this, these are 300 cases per year fewer that we are filing with our juvenile judges for law violations. And these are offenses where the youth, if we're doing our assessments correctly, if we're identifying the risk level correctly, should be our low risk, low needs youth that have now come off of the juvenile court judge's desk. And so what is left with our juvenile court judges are those youth that have the highest level of needs, that pose the highest risk to community safety. And that's what I want my juvenile court judges spending their time on and considering. That's what I want my juvenile probation officers spending their time on considering, and allowing these other diversionary programs to work their magic on those youth that pose less of a risk, both to community safety as well as to recidivism. So we're going to give you a little bit of an idea. Also, when we try to evaluate programming, we've always kind of done that separately. So, I look at my own numbers, the diversion office and our human services office that has the case managers for Project Restore, for Project SAMI. They do their own evaluations, and they've done that. And they use a tool where they're able to send out a survey to families through a text messaging system to get responses back and ask them, some kind of simple questions about how reasonable or unreasonable were the expectations, of the caseworker towards the youth when they're completing a diversion program or Restore or SAMI. And so they can get back some feedback on how reasonable or unreasonable those expectations were. They asked them how challenging the program is. And so, okay, was it very easy, moderately easy, extremely challenging? You can see the responses here generally are that, they're moderately challenging to not challenging at all, or somewhere in the middle, definitely down on the lower side. We don't have people responding back saying that these requirements were overly burdensome and challenging. How much did the child learn? And this is really, as a program, what we should be focused on is, do we think that we're educating this youth and having an impact on the youth to give us a chance at reducing recidivism on the back end? And the majority of those responding back on these surveys were giving the diversion office back some positive feedback that they thought their youth learned a lot or a great deal as part of that programming. Finally, then, how satisfied were the families with the diversion process? And you can see there, again, that's the diversion office kind of sitting in their own silo and thinking through, what do our parents and what do our youth think about their interaction with our office? So great information, and all something we're going to talk about here in a few moments when we try to get a better, clearer picture from all the disciplines. And that's where you have to bring in someone like Dr. Weiner to kind of put all that information together for us. But at this point, I'll ask Jason to kind of comment as someone that's kind of been there from the very beginning, working through those racial and ethnic disparities, committee meetings, and the development of these programs, some of the lessons that the group learned in doing this.
Yeah, thanks. First off, messaging is very important, and you're going to see that that's a thread throughout this entire lessons learned. Messaging is both internal and external. It's messaging to your staff on how this benefits. It's messaging to victims and victims' families, and also to the offenders' families on why this is a benefit. Start the MOU process very quickly. We went with an MOU, and MOUs are crafted by a variety of different attorneys and signed by a variety of different CEOs, the chief of police, the county attorney, the superintendent, and every single one of them has bosses, and every single one of them is looking through a different prism at that document. So start it very, very quickly. Ours took about a year. It sounds like a long time. It was, and hopefully yours goes shorter than that. Ensure the right stakeholders are at the table. Be diligent about who you select to be stakeholders at the table. They need to be decision makers for their agency. It doesn't have to be the CEO, but they do have to have the ear of the CEO and be able to project why this is a benefit for our community. It helps to have at least one project manager in the group to kind of keep everybody on task. And again, I think these stakeholders need to be great messengers as well. Include an evaluator from the beginning. We had me as a boat anchor originally collecting data, and cops collecting data isn't always the best thing, and that's why we implored Dr. Weiner and his staff to look at our numbers. But the other thing that brings you is an impartial eye. It's not the police department presenting data, or it's not the county attorney's office presenting data. It's someone else that can look and present on it and give you an unbiased view, hopefully. Continuously evaluate and then reevaluate all of your structures that you set up for your project. That was very important for us. We went back, we thought we had something very, very well crafted, but then in the end, you look at the numbers initially after, I think, the first year or two, and we saw that we had a high decline rate for African-American youth. They were just decided not to go through the process. And so we looked at that as a problem, and we had to figure out exactly how to correct it. And you get a lot of smart people at the table, and you come up with an idea to solve it, and then you measure what you did to figure out if you solved that problem. Another thing that Chris talked about is the speed at which referrals make it to human services. And initially we thought we had a pretty good process in place, but unfortunately, one of the linchpins there was that it was being handled, a referral in our office was being handled by a special victims unit employee. Vacations happen and sick leaves happen and other work happens. And so if that one person isn't shuffling it up the chain, then that's just unnecessary delay. So we reevaluated that and changed sort of the structure, and now our records unit handles all those and gets the eligible offenses to the county attorney's office. Funding's not always isn't always needed. Be creative, work with what you have, and sometimes if you start small and the results speak for themselves, the funding will come. And then lastly, everybody has a role to play in prevention. I think, we as law enforcement are pretty good about pointing out the deficiencies and other touch points in the system. You need to be pretty good about pointing out your own contribution to those deficiencies and address them. And so everyone has a role to play in that. So the original partnerships was the Mediation Center, the Lancaster County Attorney's Office, Lincoln Public Schools, our police department, the Lincoln Police Department. Human Services, I really have to give a shout out to Sarah Hoyle and Jenny Ryan and Becky Steiner and their staff, because they were the glue that held all of this together and kept us pulling in the same direction. And none of this really would have been possible without the guidance and the initial thought by Georgetown University, specifically Jason Zaney, Tiana Davis, Kevin Bethel. They're at the Center for Children's Law and Policy. They not only provided guidance originally, but then they also kept coming back and providing ways that we could tweak this to make it the best that it could be. Now, we expanded partnerships, like I mentioned, when you look at a program that's set up to reduce racial and ethnic disparities, and then it ends up benefiting white youth more than youth of color because they're declining out of the program. One of the suggestions that came out of our local racial and ethnic disparities committee was that perhaps a face that looks like theirs, and it's not the government, if you will, suggesting that this is a good program, may get more people into that program. And so by expanding that partnership with YWCA and the Malone Center, they're able to give us that. And then last but certainly not least, the University of Nebraska with Dr. Weiner, and you're going to hear from him shortly, is the one that showcases, they're able to look at under the hood and figure out what numbers are driving our trends and how to impact that for the better. So we appreciate all of those partnerships that go into making this program successful.
Now we just want to give you all a few minutes to get into your chat box there. Feel free to ask any of the panelists any specific questions if you have of them about either how the problems were kind of identified at the front end, or that process of developing programs like this, or kind of our initial attempts on our own to evaluate kind of how well these programs were working. Feel free to type those in. I see we do have one question from Stacy Murphy asking about how we handle the assault if it's not what she would say is a very easy to handle. We have one offender, one victim, and the offender is 100% responsible. How do we handle that versus maybe two kids mutually fighting together that have both thrown down the book bags and are willing to throw fists at each other? And Joe, maybe you can talk about that from your experience with school resource officers. What do you think is likely to happen in those scenarios as far as getting referrals or not getting referrals? And then I can speak how I would handle that too on my end if I saw that.
Right. We've really stressed over the past couple of years, especially since LB 390 came down, and we have to have co-trained school administrators and SROs with the same type of training in 12 specific areas. We've done a lot of co-training and scenario training with school teams. So the school's administrators and their SRO working as a team to train together, and we use a lot of scenarios, and this would be one of those. A straightforward assault where you have a victim and a suspect and some type of injury is a lot more likely to be considered an assault and something which is going to go through kind of the processing with the administrator and the SRO to generate a complaint. SRO would complete an incident report documenting an assault, classifying it as such, and probably referring the suspect to you. Where you have two kids in more of a mutual combat, it's what's the level of that? Is it pushing and shoving? A lot of times an SRO and administrator will say, hey, we can handle this with school discipline. There wasn't an injury or significant injury. If there was a slight injury, maybe we'd call parents and say, can we work this out at the school level? And if that's all amenable, more of a mutual push-shove type, disturbing the peace by fighting is what we generally term it here in Lincoln, may not go to a referral. If it is something that's mutual, where we think it's serious enough, that's the charge. Is disturbing the peace charge is usually how that ends up, which is much different from what people think some disturbing the peace charges might be that an SRO would issue at school, like just a student acting out or breaking up the learning day in a classroom. That type of disturbance we try not to cite on at all if there really isn't a specific victim. So we look at level of injury, what the victim wants to do, if there's primary aggressor, or if we just have two kids pushing and shoving. Those are the variables that we look at to decide where to go next.
Thanks, Joe. And I would say as that referral makes its way to my desk, I'm looking at the same things I think that Joe is looking at and that the school resource officer would be looking at about determining, okay, legally, is there an offense that's been committed? And then, what's the right response? I'm gonna look at that the same way. Legally, is there a defense here? Because sometimes we do have two people that are both, trying to cause bodily harm to each other, but is one of them legally justified in that and that they're defending themselves? And if I'm not satisfied that I can't prove the person's not acting in self-defense, well, then I can't make them do any intervention. So the charge will be just basically just dismissed at that point or declined at that point, and they wouldn't go through the restore program if there wasn't sufficient information to believe that they're actually responsible for committing some sort of violation of the law. Another question here that I'll throw to you, Jason, is you talked about the need to have the right stakeholders at the table. And Joe, also, if you want to talk about this at all, in your opinion, kind of who were those primary stakeholders? Who were some of the people that were really just key to have as part of that group initially, talking through developing this type of response?
Yep, that's a great question. So I think our agency's small enough that, and I'm in a position that I'm supposed to know pretty much everything that goes on in the department, but somebody that is pretty close to the SRO program, if you have them, is a good one to have as well. I think that you need someone fairly in tune with student discipline from the school district side, and also the county attorney's office. For us, we had the juvenile county attorney that sat on that. Alicia Henderson started it off, and then Bruce Prenda, who's now the deputy county attorney, and then now you, Chris. Everyone that sat in that seat has been a crucial player in identifying sort of the pinch points in the system, and then also, what you're seeing. And then human services, for us, it was the main glue that held all this together and kept it moving. But those are pretty much the big ones, depending on how far and wide that you want to go. Now that we've incorporated a heavy data piece, then a local researcher that's independent of any of those is very important, I feel.
And I would say as that work continued, and Jason talked about like the Racial and Ethnic Disparities Committee, they continue to be a part of this discussion, and we meet quarterly, and the data from our Project Restore and from our Project SAMI is always presented as part of those meetings. And so as our red team looks at those numbers, we get to have those discussions and try to figure out, as Jason indicated, sometimes there was a problem with declining rates, and that committee helped develop the response of bringing in some new partners to try to address those concerns. And so that's another thing I would say is keep bringing in those members that have a vested interest in what you're trying to accomplish.
And Chris, I'd say on the school side that, maybe a lot of districts double up if not the operational security, the kind of the behavioral security hat is worn by the student services director. So someone who has to do with district-wide school discipline, and then maybe also the behavioral issues or behavioral programming, PBIS or MTSSP, that person in the school district would be a good match for this type of effort.
Thanks, Joe. Well, I think we've answered the questions that are up so far, and we're going to now kind kind of transition from what the program, how it was developed into the research that's been done by Dr. Weiner and his staff. And so as we turn it over to him, he has said that we are free to interrupt him at any moment. So just type your questions in the box as he's going through what he and his staff have been doing, looking at our data the last few years. And then I'll be sure to interrupt Dr. Weiner and ask him your questions. So I'm going to stop this screen share now as Dr. Weiner gets ready to share his presentation with us. And so we'll just pause for just a moment.
All right. So I trust you can see the slide that's on the screen at the moment. It says the Lancaster County Juvenile Justice Database and Classroom to Courtroom Pathway.
Looks good.
Very good. So once again, my name is Rich Weiner. I've been working with Lancaster County for a number of years with some graduate students. And our goal has been to develop a database that connects all of the different pieces of what you've heard about with respect to juvenile justice in Lancaster County. And so I need to first talk about the two graduate students who have done most of the work on this. That's Megan Berry and Taylor Petty, who are two PhD students in our program in law and psychology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And they get to do all the work and I get to have all the glory in talking about it. So that's always an advantage of being a professor. But those two students have been helping me. We've been working on this project since 2018, November of 2018, which was when our universe, if you will, started in terms of when we started collecting this data. And we've been collecting it ever since. I also have on this slide my email address. If you have any questions, if you come up after our symposium is over, if you'd like to contact me, I'd be happy to field any questions or any additional thoughts that you might have. So this is a Lancaster County Juvenile Justice Data File, and it's something that I take a lot of pride in. We've been working on it, as I say, for about 2 years, putting it together. I can't tell you how difficult it is to put together a database of this size and this magnitude that takes into consideration so many different pieces and so many different people that are involved. And so it's been a heavy lifting burden. But we are delighted with the outcome and think we have a lot of things to say about a lot of topics, two of which are clearly Sammy into storage, you'll see in a few minutes, and also a little bit more about the police involvement in schools more generally. What I want to do is start off by talking about the data ground rules a bit. It's important to understand that this data is owned by the people that you've been listening to talk about their projects. The Lancaster County Human Services, the LPD, Lancaster County Detention, Lancaster County Attorney Office are the people that own this data, and they've entrusted it with us to analyze and to report back on our findings. They maintain the data for program evaluation purposes. This is not a UNL research project. We don't disseminate the data unless the owners direct us to do so. So this is Lancaster County data that we are privileged to be in a position to be able to help them organize and understand and evaluate the data. The role of the university in this then is to serve as program evaluation consultants for the data. What happens is these agencies de-identify the data, removing all identifying information, names, and numbers that we could possibly use to trace it back to individual children and families. They deposit it into a secure website. Then my team comes in and aggregates, organizes, and analyzes the data to answer the questions that the data owners themselves have asked of the database. So we meet with them regularly. We talk about what results we have. We talk about what their questions are, make some recommendations, and then proceed to, again, organize and analyze the data to assist them in answering the questions that they have, in fact, asked. The goal of this process is an exciting one from where we stand at the Law and Psychology program, because it allows us to help in the efforts to make evidence-based policy, so that when decisions are being made, policies being written at whatever level, at the legislative level or at the city level, at the organizational level, these decisions are being made based upon an understanding of what the data actually looks like. And we are a firm belief that when we do that, we're able to make much better policy and we have better outcomes. And so we're very excited to be part of this initiative to develop this database. So the database really excites me to talk about. And as a researcher, you know, it's clear that different people enjoy different parts of this process. But as a researcher, this is a very exciting database with lots of potential and lots of possibility to answer all kinds of questions about juvenile justice in Lancaster County. And so what does it look like? Those of you that have seen part of these presentations before will recognize this monstrosity of a flow chart diagram, which really describes what's in this database. The database on the left-hand side comes from police referrals, it comes from SAMI data, it comes from Restore data, and the areas that are highlighted in red are the areas that I'm going to talk about here this afternoon. But it also includes assessment data, diversion data, and PACS data. So it has a variety of different inputs that come into the system. And it also follows each of these youth through Lancaster County Attorney's database. And in that database, we have clusters, which are basically based on juvenile law numbers. They can include multiple incidents with a petition, a adjudication, and ultimately a disposition. And so what we do is we collect data from all of these youths and we merge them together with a single ID number so that we can track a youth over the course of their entire time that they're involved in the Lancaster County juvenile justice system, from the first referral to when they leave. And we've decided to follow them through up to 10 of these juvenile law numbers, or what we're calling clusters. We're following them across multiple years. And so we're able to ask questions like, what happens to kids that go through SAMI? And what happens to kids that go through, that are picked up by the police for an assault charge? Do they come back a second time? Do they go to SAMI? Do they go to Restore? What's the disposition in those youth? What are the relationships between those youth, their gender, their age, their race and ethnicity, and how does that look at the end of this process? So this is really an accomplishment for Lancaster County. It is, in my experience, I've been doing this sort of work for many years, getting all the parts of the system to agree to put forth this data and allow us to put it together in one large data set to be able to ask questions, to be able to develop evidence-based policy is really a unique experience. There's many times when I've tried to do this sort of work in other areas, other places, other times, and the roadblocks that you run into to get people to cooperate and give their data and trust that the data will be analyzed carefully, it's a difficult process. And so that's partly why I started off by telling you about the data and who owns it and what the responsibilities are, because that trust for us to go forward, I think, is extremely important. And we're grateful to have the opportunity from Lancaster County to be able to look at this data in the way that we have it. So as of April, and actually we do a data run, we do a data analysis and organization and reassembly about every 6 months. So this is from the last 6 months. The last time we did this was April. That includes April data. The last time we did it was May and June, actually. At that time, there were 2,057 youth, individual separate youth. And the database is organized not on incidents, but organized upon individual youth. And so as of April 2020, there were 2,057 youth in this full data file. I'm gonna present to you, as I showed you a few minutes ago, data from the police file, data from the SAMI file, and data from the Restore file, and show you some highlights. The data file itself is very rich. There's lots of information in it. We spent a lot of time looking at it together and separately and talking about what we can do with it. But I'm just going to give you some highlights of some of the most interesting findings pertaining really to the pathway, if you will, from classroom to courtroom, and what that looks like, and you know, if it exists, and how serious of an issue it is. So first I'm going to talk a little bit about the police file. It, at the moment, well, it back in April had 1,400 individual youth in that file. Once again, that goes from November 2018 through April 2020. And in a few months, we'll have probably another 500 or so that will continue on through November 2020. And the goal is in the future to keep collecting this data so that we can continue to follow these youth over their course of their time in the juvenile justice system and collect additional data to be able to make more statements and more comparisons. So first of all, we're going to talk about the LPD analyses, and these are based on referral and ticket data, again, from November through April. Just a few slides to tell you a little about who's in the data. It is 60% males, it is 40% roughly females, which is what you would probably anticipate from most of the data that we get in juvenile justice. This is a makeup, the racial and ethnicity makeup of this data set. You can see it's predominantly white, 52%, but with a sizable portion of Black youth, Hispanic youth, and then other youth. The other youth are largely Native Americans, but they include other categories as well. You can see the number for other youth is smaller, and so it is difficult to analyze them separately. As we get more data in, we're excited to be able to break down ethnicity and race of other youth into different categories besides other. Every time I use the word and talk about other with respect to race and ethnicity, I cringe. I know it glosses over a lot of individual cultural differences, but it is the only way we can deal with the data from a statistical perspective until we get more of it is to classify it along those lines. So that's what the racial and ethnic breakdown looks like of this police data. The average age in this data set is 15. You can see the distribution from very young to 19 years old. And the average typical age is 15 years. The median is a little bit higher. It's probably 15 and a half. So that's the kids that we're talking about. We're talking about mostly boys, talking about mostly white kids, but with a good dispersion of other ethnic and racial background youth and youth that are about 15 years old. So this is data on the total referrals that is returning to the police for citations and tickets from, again, November through April 2020. You can see that most of the kids in this data set have been through only once. That is, 70% of them have had only one referral. They don't come back. So that's actually pretty good news. At the same time, you can see there are some kids that come back 2 and 3 and even 4, 5, 6, 7 times, all the way down to where we have one referral that goes up to 14 different referrals in this period of time. But for the most part, 1 or 2 times is the number of tickets that children get that are in this data set. So what we've done for most of these analyses is if I go back and show you that distribution, because we really can't break out number of times until we get more data, and we may never be able to do that because there's so few kids that have been through the system twice or 3 times or 4 times. What we've done is we've created this outcome variable, which is really a dichotomous return to the police. And so there are some youth in this data set, the ones that were in that one category in the slide before, who have in fact only one referral. We have not followed them, we've not picked them up again, the police have not picked them up again, and that's the majority, that's 70% of the youth. And then we have another 30% roughly that have had at least one additional referral, 2, sometimes 3, sometimes 4, but they've had more than one referral beyond the one that brought them into this data set originally in the first place. And so also just to kind of give you an idea of what the data set looks like, this is the number of county attorney clusters, or those JL numbers. Those include incidents where youth are picked up for 1 or multiple charges. It might be picked up again the next day or 2 weeks later. And they have that same number, that same cluster until it's resolved for that particular youth. Kids then might leave and then come back a second time 6 months or 8 months later. And then if they come back a second time, we we record that as and enter that as a separate incident or a separate attorney cluster, county attorney cluster. And as you can see from this slide, most of these kids have had only one cluster, but again, 75% of them. A few of them have had two, a few of them had three, and so on. The ones that have had zero, this 185 youth, have come into the system in some way other than through the police, like directly through the school. And so we have some of those youth as well that are in this system. So now that I've given you an idea of what this data system looks like, what the data file looks like, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what we know so far. And I'm first going to talk about the school resource officer analyses, if you will, the classroom to courtroom pathway that does not involve restore, doesn't involve SAMI, just to get an idea of what that in fact might look like. And so what we find is for all of the youth that we have these police data on, there are about 30% of them, 434, who have come into this database through an SRO incident, SRO involvement, and that's how we have their number, their CFL number, their university number, ID number. They've come in through that incident or through that involvement. So that's 30%, 69, 70% have not come in through that SRO involvement. They've come in through some other way that the police stopped a youth, ticketed a youth in the street, ticketed a youth in some other capacity. And so the first question we wanted to ask is, what are the characteristics of SRO involved youth, SRO involved cases, because this has become a really important issue that not only in Lincoln, but across the country has shown a lot of interest by a lot of people into trying to understand who are these kids and what is the actual nature of this SRO involvement of youth in the schools. So here's what we found. As was mentioned before, there is some disparate impact or disparity in who is being involved with the SRO, the school resource officers. And that is, this analysis shows a probability on the y-axis of a youth being involved in an SRO incident. And on the x-axis, we have the ethnic and racial distribution of youth. And so the youth that are Hispanic have a probability of being involved in an SRO in our database of about 36%. The youth that are white, only 28%. And that's an odds ratio of 1.44, or it's 1.44 times more likely that our youth picked at random who is Hispanic in our data set. Now, that's important, it's in our data set, is likely to be involved in an SRO incident than our white youth. And that is a statistically significant difference in those probability levels. You can see that for African Americans, it's somewhere in the middle. They are not significantly different from either whites or Hispanics, but for the SRO involvement in our data set, Hispanics are more likely, for our data set, Hispanics are more likely to be involved with an SRO incident than the white youth in the data set. What else can we say? When there is SRO involvement, it is more likely for it to result from an assault referral. So you can see in the top of this graph, when there is SRO involvement, 35.4% of the time, that's going to be assault referral. 28% of those that do not have assault referral wind up in SRO. So SRO involvement in an incident is more likely to result from an assault referral than other referrals. At the same time, it is unlikely for it to result from a theft referral. So the SRO involvement, when an officer is involved with a youth in one of those schools, middle schools or high schools primarily, it's likely to be from an assault that has occurred that leads to that referral. When there is an SRO involvement, and this is quite interesting, it's likely for it to result in a human service program referral. I think that's a really important finding. We said that these are youth that are largely involved in an assault. It could also be in disturbing the peace. But for whatever reason, when there is an SRO incident report made, typically what happens to that youth, and we know this because we can follow them through our system from the various points in that data set that I showed you, that it's likely to result in a human service program referral. 38.6% of the time, when there is human service, it involves an SRO incident. SRO involvement is much more likely to have originated with a school-based complaint than with the officer, a parent, or a victim. So that tells us that when there is an SRO involvement, an SRO incident, it is likely resulting from some aspect, somebody in the school making that complaint, notifying that officer, and so the officer goes out and does an investigation. And that is a significant difference. You can see it's a large significant difference, that the probability that any particular involvement involves a school is about 86%, 0.86. So it's important to understand what that means. And actually, I have to say that until I took a look at some of the school-based data, I didn't quite know what it means. But we have a little more data that's gathered from the schools for who initiated calls for service at LPS middle schools and high schools. And you can see between 2015 through 2020, and our data really falls in this last range of 2019 to 2020. You can see during that time, those complaints, those calls are coming from a combination of students, teachers, administrators, largely, who then either the administrators and teachers themselves can inform the SRO officers, or the students inform the teachers and administrators, and then the school personnel are the ones that are asking the SRO officers to come and do an investigation of the incident and get involved. So that these school-initiated calls come from students, teachers, staff, and administrators. And so what do we know then about SRO involvement, these analyses? We know that 30% of the cases in the file involve school resources officers. There's a substantial amount. Most cases are school-initiated with calls from students, teachers, staff, and administrators. More cases involve Hispanic youth than white youth, which does not necessarily mean, I should point out, that the officers are selecting Hispanic youth. As you can see, most of the calls are actually originating in other places. There's no evidence per se that there's discrimination from that data by itself. All we can descriptively say is that Hispanic youth are more likely to wind up with an SRO involvement than our white youth. The typical case was an assault referral, and most importantly, perhaps, the typical case ends up with a human service referral, Restore, or SAMI. So there's not a whole lot of evidence to suggest in this data that SRO officers are involved in the so-called school to jail pipeline or school to prison pipeline. It looks more like what happens is that youth that are investigated in these incidences wind up in one of the human service programs like SAMI or Restore. So next I want to tell you about Restore. The data that we have from Restore, again, this is actually from November, this says January, but it's really from November 2018 through March 2020. There were 223 of those kids that we have involved in Restore that we have data from. There was no April data in 2020 because of the school closings due to the pandemic. So what do these kids look like? Again, they're mostly male. 57% are male, 42% are female. They are, again, mostly white, 45%. A little bit higher percentage of them are black than were in the general police data. There's 27 of these children that were Hispanic and 24, again, that we classify as other. The age was a little bit younger, 14 and a half, really, 14.6, as compared to the general police set data of youth. So the average age is about 14 and a half for kids that are in Restore in our data file. And now I want to tell you a little bit more about the process measures of Restore. What do we know about it? How does it work? What are the factors related to it? So first of all, we know of these 223 children that were referred for Restore, at some point, 70 of them, or 31%, were ineligible. 153 were offered the program. And I'll talk in a minute about what some of the factors of ineligibility were. We also know that the Restore success rate frequency is a 97%. So think about that for a minute, because that's a pretty remarkable number. That's telling us that 97% of the 147 kids that we have complete data from throughout this process, 97% of them were successful in completing the Restore process. They went through it, and they completed it. There's 3 that were unsuccessful due to new charges and 2 due to failure to complete the program requirements. So we know from the outset that Restore is in fact receiving students, working with students, and the students are, for the most part, successfully completing the program. What else do we know? We know that this happens fast. These are pretty impressive numbers in terms of how long it takes. For example, from the LPD referral to the county attorney's notice, 4 days. From the county attorney's notice to the Restore referral, another 2 days. From Restore referral to intake, another 10 days. Intake to discharge, 42 days, which is well within the range that the program was set out to establish. And in fact, from LPT referral to discharge is about 58 days from beginning to end for Project Restore. So that's pretty quick. As Chris has indicated, when these referrals come through his desk, they quickly go to where they need to go. And these data would suggest that, in fact, that's happening at a pretty fast rate. What about recidivism analysis? What do we know about what happens to the kids that come out of Restore? Well, this is a pretty interesting graph. It shows that of those youth who are accepted into Restore, only 26% are subsequently rearrested, returned to the police. And compared to 54% of those who are not accepted into Restore, and you can look at that comparison down here. Those are youth who are not accepted into Restore. They are much more likely to wind up with a second referral, a second police ticket. Now, I have to point out that those are numbers that are consistent with Restore being successful. They don't demonstrate that the reason for the reduction in recidivism is because of Restore as a program, right? In order to do that, we would have to do a comparison between kids that are in Restore and similar kids that are not in Restore. We don't quite have enough data to do that yet in this data file, but soon we'll be able to take the, whatever it was, 150 kids that go through the Restore process and compare them to a similar group of youth that are not in Restore, that are in our data file, and we'll be able to, at that point, be able to say something more about Restore being responsible for those reduction in recidivism. But before that, at the moment, we can say that these data are consistent with the fact that children who go through Restore are less likely to return through the police. So what is our summary for the Restore analyses? First of all, 31% of referrals are ineligible for Restore. 97% of youth referred to Restore successfully complete the program, a really impressive rate. Approximately 8 weeks on average elapse between the police referral to Restore and completion of the program. The youth who are referred to Restore and completed are unlikely to pick up another police referral, although, as I pointed out, that doesn't necessarily mean Restore is responsible for the reduction. It does mean that this is consistent with Restore being a successful program, pending additional analyses and data. So now let me tell you a little bit about SAMI. We have fewer kids in SAMI. There's 156 that we have in our universe from November, through March. Again, there's no April data. SAMI demographics these are again mostly males, about 65%. More males, more actually percentage of males than some of the other data we've looked at. 34% are girls. The race breakdown is similar. 79% are white, 32 are, as a number, 79 are white, 32 are black, 26 are Hispanic out of these 148. So that range is fairly similar to the ones we looked at before. The age breakdown, about 15, similar to the other age breakdowns we looked at, a little bit closer, maybe slightly older than the typical youth in the police data set. The SAMI process measures. So of these 156 youth that have SAMI referrals, 53%, 84 of them are ineligible, which is a number that we need to dive down into deeper and understand more why that's occurring. 34% of them were offered the program and 19 were not offered the program. And so we know less about this program because we only have these 53 youth that were involved in it, but we do know some things about it. And this is important to understand. The reason why the youth was ineligible for the SAMI program 32 of them were based upon the difficulty in prosecuting youth for marijuana violations after LB 657, which requires that a certain percentage of THC is in the marijuana or the substance that the youth is being caught with. And that's difficult to have the equipment to be able to carry on that prosecution. And as Chris has said, if there's not a positive enough data to go forward with the prosecution, then that youth is not going to be offered SAMI. 13 of those youth were on probation. 9 have already another court involvement. 6 were currently on diversion for the same charge, and then the rest you can see really go over across a number of different reasons why the youth was ineligible. The reason for SAMI program not being offered is another important factor to take a look at. Mostly it's because the school chose not to offer SAMI program to the youth. There's few that were repeated offenses and some that had a weapon at the time of the incident. SAMI success rate, again, not quite as high as Restore, but pretty high. 90% of the youth, 47 of the 52 that were referred to SAMI and accepted, completed the program successfully. Now, that's also an extraordinarily high success rate. So that is, again, consistent with SAMI doing what it's supposed to do. The actual statement to be able to say that SAMI is responsible for success requires a matched comparison group that we don't yet have enough data to collect and make decisions on. But again, the time from LPD to county attorney notice, 3 days. SAMI happens fast, as it's supposed to. This is a credit to the Lancaster County system. This happens quickly. From the county attorney notice to SAMI referral, 3 days. From SAMI referral to discharge is only 10 days, and the whole process takes 2 weeks. So SAMI occurs quickly. Kids are referred, they go into the program, and they come out. So that's in the direction of being a successful program. So what are the summaries for the SAMI analyses? 54% of referrals are ineligible for SAMI, something to think about and focus in on. The chief reasons for ineligibility are difficulties in prosecuting for marijuana use. The youth are currently on probation. The youth is court involved already, or the youth is on diversion for the same charge. 96% of youth who are referred to SAMI successfully complete the program. It takes approximately 2 weeks between the police referral to SAMI and the completion of the program. And we don't really yet have enough data to estimate the likelihood of recidivism for those who complete, but we will hopefully, even as we speak, in the data that's being processed in the last 6 months of this year. So basically, that's what we know so far. I could say a lot more from this database about other aspects of the system, including more about the county attorney data and more about other diversion. But for our purposes this afternoon, that's a pretty good summary of what we know, where we're at. We plan to continue collecting data ongoing and be able to ask more sophisticated and more subtle questions, and particularly questions about recidivism and whether or not these programs are the cause of reduction of recidivism rather than just simply associated with a reduction in recidivism. As we go along, we'll have enough data to be able to make some of those comparisons. It's been an honor to be involved in organizing this Lancaster database and to be able to work with LPD and county attorney and schools to be able to pose and answer questions that we hope will be helpful to them in setting policy and making decisions on how best to serve these youth in Lancaster County. So with that, I didn't see any questions come up during the presentation, but I'll be happy to take any that anybody has now.
We do have one question, Dr. Weiner, going back to the youth involved with SROs and who and where the calls for service are initiated. They're asking, does the overall racial composite of the school population, is that considered, or is it a factor when you're analyzing the data?
So these data are really about just the youth that we have information concerning coming through the police with a referral ticket. So we have not compared them to the composition of, I guess it would be the youth in the county. Now, on other projects, I have done that. We could do that. But and that would be an important step to take, in fact, to understand, for example, the fact that we have more Hispanic youth that are referred through SRO than white kids. So it would be important to compare those numbers. And if in fact, at some point in time, that becomes a question that the owners of the data set would like to pose, we would go ahead and find that information and compare those ratios. But it's important, and we will make recommendations about those questions. We haven't done it yet. I use this as an opportunity to point out that the questions that we analyze from this data set are questions that come from the owners of the data set, not from the university.
And I don't see any other questions, and I see that we've taken all the time that we were allowed. So we certainly appreciate Dr. Weiner coming in and sharing that data with us. Captain Stilley and Joe Wright, appreciate also your investment, not only in the project, but in willing to come in and share that information and how this program was developed. So thank you very much, folks, for coming with us, and appreciate your time. Thank you.